The next topic we're going to cover here are some more suppressing operators that are defined in the mono class. So before, the suppressing operators we had talked about would ignore the payload. It was things like then, if you recall, then, which was it ignored the results and just returned a mono to void. And now we're going to talk about materialize and fromRunnable. These are rather obscure operators, quite frankly, but they tend to be very helpful in certain circumstances, and we'll see some examples here as we go through this. So we'll talk about the materialize operator first. What it does is it transforms any incoming on next, on error, or on complete signals into a so-called signal instance, which thereby materializes these signals. I don't invent these names. They come from the people who designed this class. I think it's a little bit goofy, but that's what it's called, materialize. And so what materialize returns is a mono that will first emit a signal complete, indicating we're done, which effectively completes the mono. It says we're finished, the computations are done. And this particular data suppressing operator just ignores its payload. And it's most commonly used in cases like this, which we just looked at a minute ago, where you have when, where when is going to wait for a bunch of asynchronous computations to finish, and it will then emit a signal which we materialize just to say we're done. No matter what happens, we're done. Again, I'm not quite sure why they need to have materialize in this case, but it plays a role, and we have to use it in this particular context. RxJava has a materialize operator that works in the same way. The next suppressing operator we're going to look at is called fromRunnable. And what this does is it executes a given runnable and then returns a mono. So let's take a look and see how it works. The runnable parameter is executed before emitting the completion signal. And it returns a mono that completes empty. So let's take a look at an example. What you typically use this for is to trigger some final processing before completion is done. So let's take a look at an example. And this example is something we'll look at later when we get more into the fluxes. So we're going to make basically a stream of big integers using this, this create factor method. We'll talk about that later. This just makes a stream of big integers, random big integers. And then we're going to check to see if each of the big integers is prime or not. So we're going to see if it's prime using a prime number checker. And then we're going to go ahead and essentially have this runnable called. So the runnable here is going to display the results of doing all this checking, and it will then return an empty mono, which will sync with the async task barrier. So it's basically kind of like a finalize hook, if you will. It's a way of saying, before we're done, run this piece of code to print stuff out. Strangely enough, there is no RxJava equivalent to fromRunnable in their single class. However, there's a method that's also part of Project Reactor called doFinally. And if you've got an observable, which is like a flux in RxJava, you can have a doFinally operator, and it will do this as the very last thing before the observable stream is done. So in this particular case, we could do the same thing. We could say display the results in the string buffer before shutting down that processing. So you can get much the same effect. There's a then run method in Java Completable Futures. We didn't really talk much about then run, but it's there, and so you can use that. It's then run is very much like then except. It's typically used at the end of a chain of completion stage methods in the Completable Futures framework. All right, that's the end of the discussion of suppressing operators. Suppressing operators, again, are somewhat esoteric, but they come in very handy, as we've seen.